Welcome to the Lehman College Art Gallery online, where we are very pleased today to be joined by members and participants in Young, Gifted, and Black, which is the Lumpkin family collection of contemporary art. And that work has been on view at the gallery. We had a wonderful opening in the February of 2020, and as we all know, things went a bit haywire after that. My name is Bartholomew Bland. I'm the executive director of Lehman College Art Gallery, and today I'm joined by Bernard Lumpkin, who is the wonderful collector, a major mover and shaker in the contemporary art world that we're very happy to have worked with on this exciting exhibition. I'm also joined by Matt Wycoff, who is the co-curator of the exhibition, with Antoine Sargent, who is the editor of the accompanying catalog that has just been released and is a major publication on this extensive collection. And we are joined by three of the artists that are in the exhibition. Tomashi Jackson is represented in the exhibition by the piece Magnet School 1 from 2014. We are also joined by Alteronce Gumby, who is represented in the exhibition by Gumby Nation 2014. And finally, we are joined by Tunji Adeniyi-Jones, who is represented in the exhibition by Blue Dancer 2017. And it's a real honor and pleasure to have all of these artists with us today. And I know that Matt has prepared an interesting dialogue for us, which will be based around the title of The Spirit, the Self, and the Object. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Bart, and thank you to Lehman College for hosting the exhibition. Obviously, thanks to Bernard for putting all this into motion, and thanks to the three artists for joining us today. The theme for this discussion, as Bart mentioned, is the spirit, the self, and the object. And my idea was just to direct one of those topics at each of you and sort of let you each speak to that topic. And sort of before I turn it over to you, I'll sort of frame in how I'm thinking about the idea, and then you can sort of take that and sort of run with it in sort of whatever way you sort of think is most applicable to your work. So, and then if I think of any follow-up questions, I'll jump in, and then sort of after each artist has spoken for a little while, other artists can jump in, or Bernard can jump in, or it can sort of be more open form. And so I'd like to begin with the idea of the spirit, maybe a little high-minded, but I think maybe that's appropriate for these times. And I'd like to take sort of a little bit of a historical view onto the creation of religious or ceremonial objects that originated within local communities and cultures all around the world. In Europe, I'm thinking of icon paintings, paintings that represent sort of biblical stories. Of course, all across continental Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, you have all sorts of objects produced for religious or ceremonial purpose, from masks and headdresses to clothing, objects, carvings, architecture. Other examples might be sequined flags that were produced in Haiti for religious ceremonies, or even Navajo weaving in North America sort of prior to colonialization of North America. And sort of as that sort of colonial period got underway, many of these objects that had been created for ceremonial or religious purposes were sort of stolen and put into private collections, put into museums. And one consequence of this, sort of as that unfolded, was that some of these objects sort of transferred into being trade objects, being created for sale or for trade. And I think that there's certainly a lineage of contemporary art that sort of emerges out of the production of these objects and their sort of dispersal all around the world through these various means. And when I sort of look at Tunji's work, I really see this sort of history in the background of your work, and I see connections. You know, one of the things that sort of links these objects that were produced in all these different cultures is the use of bold color, pattern, richly embellished surfaces, texture, and of course time, the visible presence of time in the making of the objects. And so, I see sort of connections, and I think Blue Dancer is a good example of this sort of thing that I'm talking about in your work. And so I guess I'd like to start by just sort of hearing you sort of talk about the idea of the spirit, the idea of spirituality in your practice, and maybe if you sort of see connections to the things I'm speaking about sort of in your own work, if that's a part of your thinking of your own work, and sort of what that's like for you. And then I understand that you're also very interested in Yoruba culture, which is sort of, I know of that through the creation of like very intricately beaded tunics and headdresses. And so maybe as a point of reference, if you want to sort of mention your interest in that and sort of how that comes about and if that plays into any of these themes that I'm discussing. So I'll let you sort of take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. That was wonderfully articulated. Very considered too. I kind of, feel strongly about everything that you mentioned. It's been an interesting experience for me moving to this country, living here and growing here. I think almost all of the Alteronce Tomashi and Bernard can speak to that, having been through various stages of my journey of that with me. It's been interesting to notice how there are certain aspects of my Blackness that have changed and developed as I've moved around through, like, along the West African coast, through Europe, and now here, and how that constant shift informs sort of the work I make. And I think the Blue Dancer was like a nice snapshot of that moment of me realizing that, it's definitely a transnational, fluid kind of experience that I'm going to be having on a regular basis, not necessarily feeling too settled in any particular environment or feeling like there's something to learn in any environment, I guess is the best way to put it. And a good example of that is you're mentioning the history of those objects, the traditional sculptures, is to think about how the Blue Dancer painting has some formal similarities to the work of, say, artists like Aaron Douglas or Harlem Renaissance artists in like the late 20th century, who I frankly had no exposure to before I moved here, and who I don't really share much with. The only thing I share with them is an affinity to the source material, an affinity to the continent. And I think it's very interesting when we start to think about how I would have been looking at, and I'm looking at the same things that they would have been looking at, or thinking about the same material. I think that kind of through line and continuity is really important as I kind of like move around and experience things in different places. So I definitely feel like the Blue Dancer is a result of me understanding kind of like the transnational spirit of, just my Blackness, every sort of like the Black identity as it shifts, we all experience it in different ways. And I think that image is a nice snapshot of it, of that experience. As far as the Yoruba aspect of it goes, I mean, that's my culture, that's my inheritance, that's my family. So it's in everything I do, I'm trying to learn more on a regular basis. I mean, if we want to talk about transnational, Yoruba culture is in Latin America, it's in North America, it's everywhere across the world. And there are traces of it that have manifested and developed and transformed in ways that are kind of impossible to contain. So in a regard, that is something that I think about with my work too sometimes, when I'm trying to perhaps represent something that's like a bit greater than just a simple two-dimensional form or image. That's something I'm very conscious of too. I don't want to try and, contain something too much. I do want it to seem open and again, fluid. So that's why with a painting like Blue Dancer, it's very nondescript, it's very androgynous, it's very, it's a couple of things at once. Recently, someone said to me that they thought it was a self-portrait, which I thought was interesting. I haven't heard that before, but I fully agree with it. There's definitely an element of how I see myself developing and changing every day here and as I move around the world. So I would want it to seem accessible as well, though. Would want it to seem like other people can see themselves in that space too. But there's definitely an element of myself, my spirit that I put into this work. And that spirit is constantly changing and being informed by people I meet and places I go. It's a wonderful opportunity. I feel like so fortunate to be able to be here, to be able to move the way I have been able to up until this point. So yeah, I don't take any of it for granted.
I mean, it's a fascinating point that you make about sort of artists from different cultures, different places, sort of looking at the same source material and arriving at. I mean, that's really sort of fascinating sort of angle to put on it that I hadn't really like considered as I was drafting that. So I think that's really interesting and really useful, sort of in thinking about this conversation sort of going forward.
And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people. Sorry, I think a lot of people, just to quickly say, also would assume perhaps that people that I meet on a regular basis that I'm from here or that I'm local to the US based on the way that my work is developing, and it's, you know, of course, heavily informed by this environment that I'm in. So I think it would be strange if it didn't start to look a bit like I was from here, because I'm very sensitive to the sort of like histories and lineages I'm now involved in just by being here too. So it's like a very, there are lots of kind of angles to it. There are parts of me that feel like the work is functioning in a successful way when people maybe look at it and assume that I'm from here and don't think about the fact that I'm from London, or, you know, it's hard. I think that's also the work, or like my practice succeeding in the way I want it to, if I'm really kind of like absorbing my environment and doing the required like research and things like that.
Right.
Tunji, I just wanted to ask you, I was very interested in the idea that you were talking about Aaron Douglas, who, because I trained in 19th and early 20th century American art, was such a huge figure. And to realize that most American artists sort of pre-Jackson Pollock really don't have much international standing necessarily, and being sort of household words, or even other artists sort of know. So was that a big discovery process for you of like sort of the Harlem Renaissance artists, or any sort of early?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Tomashi and Alteronce can speak to, because they were pretty much there when I was exposed to a lot of this stuff for the first time. My exposure to art history in London was very much on the like hyper Eurocentric end of things, and artists and painters that I really aspired to or focused on through in and out of my educational system were just not these kinds of artists. So I came here and I was, Aaron Douglas, and they were like, who else, like Ernie Barnes, like there were so many people who I had never heard of, Bob Thompson, you know, artists like this completely like changed my whole trajectory when I saw that was a thing, you know, that existed. Didn't know it existed before. So and that it became like an addictive space. So that's why, you know, I'm still here. It's 5 years later. Like I wanted to kind of really dig into that space and understand that if I was making an image that resembled something that I had no idea about before, that there was something interesting there to play with.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess one other question I had along those lines is like just sort of thinking about New York and thinking about the sort of the commercial side of the production of these objects and the balance of like the personal, and to sort of bring this a little bit back to the idea of the spirit, like juggling the sort of demands that like a professional commercial practice sort of puts on an individual, sort of versus the sort of internal sort of spiritual personal journey that like you described so well in terms of moving from place to place. Like how do you balance sort of those concerns?
It's a difficult one. I still haven't quite figured it out. It's a work in progress. I think it is increasingly important to. I guess I regularly take stock and I sit and reflect and try and make sure that I'm like not getting too lost in everything that's happening. I mean, I have a lot of family on the East Coast, so I've been coming to America for a while. I do have places I can go. I do have like certain connections or like familial bases here that I can ground myself in, so that I don't feel like I'm too much of a nomad just kind of floating around. But yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely something that I have to be conscious of. I'm hoping that investigation comes through in the work, you know, I'm hoping that you do feel a sense that that's something I'm trying to work through on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it's interesting to maybe just to hear maybe Tomashi jump in, having just opened this major exhibition, which I'm sure was sort of a frenzied sort of time period of production and all the logistics that go into that. Did you find yourself sort of trying to balance the sort of internal, sort of personal sort of motivations for making the work against the sort of production timelines and the logistics of working towards a major exhibition like the one that just opened?
For sure. Yeah. Yes.
Fair enough.
Short answer.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say, but yes. I guess I was supposed to have been in Columbus, Ohio. My ideal way of making work about a place I'm not from, where I haven't lived, would be to go there and to spend time there and to listen to people and to just kind of get a sense of the patterns of public space. And I wasn't able to do that because of the pandemic. So much of the frenzy coordination had to do with figuring out what the work was supposed to be, working with the team at the Wexner Center and my gallerist at Tilton Gallery, and our visual solution printers who produce my vinyls, my vinyl additions to the paintings, and working with my co-creator, my co-creator in spirit and carpenter, Ruben Palencia, based out of Los Angeles. That was scary sometimes. Oh, and figuring out where I was going to even be able to make the work, whatever it was supposed to be, because I'm in exile from my studio in New York City. So there were definitely like sleepless nights, lots of worry, a deadline that really seemed unchanging, like bravely unchanging, but a fair amount of confusion on my part around how any of it was actually going to be possible. So luckily I was working with people in different states, a team of understanding people who were willing to work through that with me and send me stuff, send me materials, organize conversations with people, Ohioans. And all of that ended up guiding me to know what the imagery should look like. And I think it's a beautiful show. I love them, actually. We started off in this relationship that was quite anxious. And I fell in love with them when I actually finally was able to get into a studio and produce. Right. So yeah, and then I feel like at that point, the spirit and the deadline, eventually we became one. Thankfully.
I mean, that idea of the process sort of being the grounding agent, sort of amidst, all the other things that are necessary to sort of make something happen like that in the world, I think makes a lot of sense. And I think rhymes with sort of what Tunji was saying. And maybe is a good segue to bring Alteronce into the discussion. And, the second part of the structure of this that I had sort of conceived was to talk about the self, and sort of part of that is the idea of identity, and to talk about that really came out of looking at Alteronce's painting Gumby Nation, which is from 2014, and sort of it's such a sort of somber and almost it's a somber and serious painting, but it's also sort of full of this sly humor that's very disarming and very charming. And so I was really curious just to sort of, to begin this section, to hear Alteronce sort of speak to the development of using that image of Gumby as this sort of personal talisman, and what that process was like, deciding to sort of to use that in the work. And then maybe we can sort of expand the conversation sort of after you sort of initially speak to what that process was like at sort of negotiating that. I mean, the obvious thing is that it shares your last name, but maybe you can sort of take it from there and speak to how that was arrived at.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Bart, Matt, Bernard, Tomashi, Tunji, everyone for allowing me to be a part of this conversation and for being here today. Yeah, Gumby Nation kind of really started as a reflection on my own personal identity. I feel like I've always been a lover of abstraction, of painting, and have always thought of the process of making art as a way to kind of bringing one's awareness to your own self and relationship to the world through the process of making and through the process of observation and interpretation of the world around you. And I found myself in grad school really asking myself a lot of questions of who I am, why I'm making work, where do I come from, where am I going, and all these questions kind of congealed and kind of arrived when I started, really reflecting on my surname, my family name, and noticing that I couldn't really trace that back to Africa or any other place of really origin, as some Europeans or people of other ethnicities or descendants can do. So, especially as an African American, so I kind of took the trajectory of looking at pop culture and looking at this cartoon character called Gumby, who shares the same name as me, but is really not of my generation. And watching those cartoons, I started noticing that Gumby had this sense of otherness about him, which I often share, being a person of color and moving through the world, especially in higher education or other places around the country, or going to Europe, where I'm kind of seen as the other. So thinking about that and noticing how Gumby was kind of like the colored kid on the block. Him and his kooky friends, they were all aliens, right? Kind of in 1950, 1960, white suburbia. And, but also noticing that Gumby had this attribute of, he had these powers. He was able to use his imagination to kind of go through books. He could time travel. He can shapeshift. And that was kind of his place of salvation. That was his safe space, where he can go and truly be who he is and interact with kings and queens and other times and places. And I thought that was really interesting, because sometimes when I find myself walking through the MoMA or the Whitney, and I'm seeing these various paintings by these artists, I kind of have that same experience. Especially being an artist, I kind of want to have a conversation with Picasso. I'd love to picture myself sitting in the red studio of Matisse, or being on a block party of Archibald Monti, and just thinking of this kind of lost history that of Africa that we don't have the privilege of really learning in school. I think Tunji touched on that, is that you get to a certain point in your education where there's this certain history, especially of Black culture, that's kind of lost to us. And I felt like, as an artist, I thought it would be a great practice for me to try to reimagine that, and to reimagine this history, or to reclaim this history that was kind of taken away from me and wasn't really offered, and trace that back to my origin. So to kind of imagine a tribe of my ancestors, tribe of my origin back in maybe Africa, where everybody was a Gumby, and what that place would be, a place of thinkers, creatives, scientists, intellects, just a thriving society. And that's kind of where the idea of this painting came from. And I also kind of wanted to reimagine the process of painting at the same time. So Gumby Nation is actually a painting made from the process of actually melting down the material in which the claymation character was made of, which is plastiline clay, and kind of pouring it onto the canvas and these kind of dark tones of various shades of blues and greens to try to conjure this atmosphere of a community of people kind of living harmoniously together.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and the imagery is so evocative as you sort of speak about it. The comparison to walking through MoMA to the time travel of Gumby and that stuff. Thank you for that. It's really interesting and really engaging. I think I had sort of like as a follow-up to that, I mean, I had in my notes sort of thinking about sort of other artists sort of in the Western tradition that had sort of gotten into the idea of sort of mining identity and really thinking about identity sort of as a basis for the work, and thinking about Duchamp's alter ego of Rose Sélavy or Cindy Sherman's work and things like that. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about more recent work, because Gumby Nation was from 2014. And from my sort of reading of the work has made some shifts between 2014 and now, and sort of I think it would be interesting to hear you talk about how those themes that were sort of emerged out of the Gumby Nation paintings have sort of transformed and how they're present in the newer work.
Yeah, I feel like that work was made that like maybe possibly my first semester in grad school. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody who's kind of been in that position as an artist, being in grad school, you kind of take all of your ideas and interests that you kind of have circling around your studio and kind of just throw it at the wall. You just throw it at the canvas. You try to get it out. And the work has, definitely gone through a lot of transitions since then. I feel like, the Gumby image itself has kind of deteriorated or shapeshift in other aspects or maybe other forms of lexicon within my work. But I think the idea of making a painting through alternative mediums has definitely stayed consistent. So from the process of making Gumby Nation, I couldn't really use a brush through that process because of the material I was using. Once I pulled the clay from the crock pot, which I was melting in my studio, I couldn't paint, smooth it out with a brush. I eventually started using my hand, wearing an oven mitt to kind of protect myself from the hot clay. And so a process of kind of finger painting developed from that, which then led to me kind of even thinking about the idea of tonal painting from the process of making this kind of dark tonal Gumby Nation painting has also continued and evolved, where I'm kind of thinking about aspects of color and its relationship to identity, and how that is a very diverse and complicated issue, especially given social structures and the way people of color have been identified or kind of tethered to the idea of color through identity. And so all those things have kind of just started to expand in my work. And now I find myself still making tonal paintings, more currently working with glass, tempered glass specifically. And just still trying kind of like building on these ideas. In terms of like Duchamp and Cindy Sherman, I feel like those are very much like figurative photographs, right? And I feel like Gumby Nation is very much a painting. And I think there's a difference between putting on makeup or costume and taking a picture to kind of create this alternative sense of the identity rather than a process of actually making a painting and reflecting on various ideas of oneself and history and relationship to society.
Right.
Oh, Alteronce, I wanted to ask you, I love the surface of your painting, and it's so subtle. When we were first looking at the show and looking at it in a checklist format, I think I saw it first at Bernard's apartment. Photography doesn't really capture as it in so many tonal paintings. And I'm wondering from a practical standpoint, with everyone spending all their time glazed over on Instagram, and your work is not really that conducive. Those kind of tonal paintings are not really that conducive. Do you find that the constant reproduction in media there's a pressure on your work that way, or do you just not worry about it and worry about just the actual physical encounter in the gallery?
I am more into the actual physical encounter in the gallery. I feel like now in contemporary times, you want people kind of want the image to look good in reproduction on Instagram and to send out in PDFs, especially with the current state of the world. But I'm someone who loves going into the gallery, into the space, and actually looking at paintings in person and just sitting there for a while. I feel like my work is very much closely related to the materials in which I used and how those resonate when your body is interacting with them in the physical space. And honestly, I kind of like that my paintings are hard to photograph because I think maybe that will entice the viewer to actually see them in person, to kind of close this distance, even though we're all trying to practice social distancing. But I don't think you have to do that when it comes to paintings. You're not going to catch COVID from a painting, at least.
Well, that comes a little back to that.
We can now. So, but yeah, I kind of, and especially in my studio, I spend a lot of time looking at my work and investigating the materials in which I'm using and interacting with them. And I think, every artist on this panel kind of has that close relationship with the material in which they're using. And that, there isn't that desire, at least for me in my studio, to have an image be rendered so well, in digital format. If that were the case, I'd be making photographs or I'd be making video.
Well, it sort of brings back to Matt's original topic about the spirit, because you do feel that kind of spirit when you're alone in the gallery with your work, that it comes through in a very particular, nuanced way.
Yeah.
I would jump in and say that your recent stuff, Alteronce, definitely looks really good online too. Like it looks good, man. And then it's like, I think it's got that extra dimension where when you then see it in person with the physical reflective nature of the glass and the pigment, it's just an added bonus. So you're hitting us like with two, it's yeah, I'll be quiet, but it's doing its thing.
No, credit to the photographers in Photoshop for finding that balance. I kind of step away when it gets to that point, because especially with the glass, the surfaces are highly reflective, and you are constantly getting these reflections of the environment kind of coming in. So I remember at one point getting one of the glass paintings photographed, and it was actually the first time getting one of these paintings photographed, and the photographer was just really frustrated because they didn't bring a black cloth to kind of hide themselves in it. And it was funny because I was just sitting there watching them. I was like, one of the aspects of me using glass is that the viewer can kind of see themselves and then lose themselves in the painting physically. So it's I don't know, it's kind of a catch-22 in a sense.
In thinking about identity and thinking about sort of the those themes, I thought it might be interesting to sort of have you sort of chime in. The larger project sort of started with you thinking about identity and your father and sort of your own personal identity, and maybe to have you sort of speak to your eye as you're going around looking at things to add to the collection, things that are meaningful to you, if that idea of identity and people sort of thinking about identity, wrestling with identity through making the work is something obviously that you're interested in. So maybe just to have you speak to that a little bit to bring you into the conversation would be nice.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And again, also thanks to each of you, Bart, for hosting us at Lehman College. Such a great opening, such a great exhibition, such a great installation.
We started at the peak.
I'm thinking of the Rotunda wall. Again, for some reason, I just thought of that, which was inspired, of course, by Tunji's Blue Dancer painting, and which was such a great way to welcome visitors to the show. Matt, obviously, for co-curating such an amazing extension and deepening of the dialogue that you and I have shared about the collection over the years. And of course, Tomashi, Tunji, and Alteronce. I'm so grateful that you have shared your work and your thinking with me over the years, and that I get to experience the joy of living with your work at home and thinking about the conversations that we had and are having about the work. And now that this exhibition, Young Gifted Black, gives me the chance to share that work with the world in a much wider way. So just a lot of gratitude for being able to have this experience. I mean, I think the collection very much, people ask me often about collecting and, how do you start a collection and what should you focus on? And, is it about medium? Is it about painting? Is it about photography? Is it about contemporary art? Is it about, a period or a movement that I'm particularly interested in? And I always tell people, ask yourself that question and figure out what it is that makes you passionate about art, and figure out what it is about certain kinds of artists that attract your attention or that resonate. For me, that was always a question we sort of began with my family. And so I was interested in telling these stories and continuing a sort of dialogue that I began with my father and, with other members of my family, which had to do with sort of, identity and, the complications around being a person of color in America. What does it mean to be American? And, for my immediate family, for my parents, it was both, a very specific experience in America. My father, of course, was born here, African-American, but he was born in Watts, which was, a poor section of South Los Angeles. And, he always envisioned a life for himself elsewhere, in New York City, in Europe. And so for him, I think being American wasn't something that he fully was able to realize until he left his home and where he grew up. And it was also connected with his dream of what his work was, which would be to be a scientist. And, that wasn't something that was going to happen in his hometown. For my mother, it was a very interesting sort of journey to America. It was the immigrant's journey. And her family came here from Tangiers, Morocco, initially to follow other family members who had emigrated to the United States, but then more specifically and sort of more urgently was to seek medical care for her father, which was my maternal grandfather. My middle name is Isaac. His name was Isaac. And he was so sick that, in fact, he died on the way to the United States. They were flying from Morocco, and they had to make an emergency landing in Madrid. And my grandfather's actually buried in the cemetery in Madrid, the British National Cemetery in Madrid. So it was a journey which I think for my mother, was and is, a journey of freedom, but there was also pain and suffering and sort of tragedy involved in coming to America. And so I think for her, being American was always sort of fraught and tinged with that sense of sort of loss. You know, for me, I inherited from my parents these, you know, they say you inherit the wounds of your family or the scars of your family or the trauma of your family. That trauma is something that can be inherited. And depending on how you define your family, you can think of, you know, the Middle Passage as something which, you know, people inherit. You can think of the great stories of the migrations to the United States, such as my mother, but, you know, other migrations of other nationalities and ethnic groups. So I think that, you know, what attracted me and what continues to attract me to artists of color are these questions and these struggles and this wrestling when it comes to, you know, making work about, you know, the American experience, and complicating what that means, the American experience, and questioning it and critiquing it. And so for me, I think, you know, what Tomashi and what Tunji and Alteronce, you know, have afforded me is a way to continue sort of that journey of understanding, of self-understanding, of understanding the world. And what I'm grateful for is that, you know, as the world changes, your questions around those issues change too. And I feel like the past 6 months has obviously been a time when, you know, the country is again struggling with, you know, what it means to be American, and it's not always a pleasant, happy journey, and it's not always the answers that we want, maybe. But I feel like, you know, if we follow the example of artists like these three, then we will definitely see some glimpses of the future, and maybe a better future than what we've known, and maybe some answers, you know, which are lingering, will begin to become clearer. So, you know, I'm hitching my wagon to their stars, as it were. And, you know, it's a scary journey. It's an exciting journey. It's a journey full of surprises and revelations. But I feel that, you know, what I can do is sort of share that with the world as widely as possible, and hope that other people learn and experience the sort of joy and the pain of self-knowledge that I have learned myself through living with, exhibiting, and now sharing their work with the world.
I wanted to start with Tomashi's work. Maybe isn't the place to start, and maybe just to have Tomashi sort of pick up right where you left off, Bernard. I mean, sort of the work that Tomashi's making now, sort of dealing directly with some of the issues that Bernard was just speaking to. Sort of, it might be interesting just to have Tomashi sort of pick up right there, and then we can kind of come back around to some of the remarks that I had planned. I mean, I think with the exhibition that Tomashi just opened, I think she could sort of take those comments, the things that you were just speaking towards, and sort of run with that. Do you want to pick up right where Bernard left off, and speaking about your work and sort of dealing directly with, you know, some of those things that Bernard was speaking of in terms of the material that you're using in the work?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying thank you. Thank you for organizing this conversation. Thank you, Bartholomew. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Carmine, not pictured or heard on screen or in sound. Thank you to the children who live with this work and will grow up to interpret it. Ooh, God, I just felt a little weepy for a second. But, like, you know, like they're actually our audience, you know, like they're the ones who spend all kinds of time together surrounded by the work in this collection. And they will live to tell the story. So it's really an honor to be a part of this cohort with such an extraordinary foundation already, and knowing that it will continue to expand in these thoughtful ways. Gosh, so much going on here. So the collection begins with the influence of Bernard's father, who was born and raised in Watts. I'm from Los Angeles, and I just think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I think that just might be because that's where I learned to see, felt my first compulsions to make. one of my great aunts lived in Compton, had a house in Compton. So to get to her, we would drive through Watts, and I would hear stories about how country it was. California is interesting because there are these, like, we are the products of the Great Migration from the South. Between the 30s and the 50s, there were these other waves that happened, not from the Deep South, but from the Southwest. Being curious about these origins for my family and for other people in communities that I found myself placed in Los Angeles, leaving home to live in San Francisco with my first go at art school. I was a wild child, but I would walk around asking people questions about how they got to wherever we were, just very curious about that. So what I've learned over the years is that I didn't get, like, Alteronce talked about history being withheld, and so did Tunji. History being withheld, and I feel like it's really a matter of like embracing what isn't known, and humbly asking questions, like seeking questions. So I would ask the homies on the corner, the elders on their stoops, the sisters at the bakery, the people I was climbing scaffolding with to paint murals. How did you get here? How did your people get here? What's the story? And I ended up learning so much more about my family and myself, about, like, it's not just us who are Texas, California people. There were waves of Black and brown people who were coming at the same time. And I realized that a lot of my friends in elementary school and high school, we were of that cohort, that cohort of descendants, but it wasn't being spoken about in historical sense. So a part of what I feel so much about the public nature of what it is we all do, the public nature of collecting, the responsibility, what Bartholomew and the team at Lehman College Art Gallery are doing, what the art periodicals do, is continuing the work of affirming the fact that art history is a social history. We're people making things. We're people who came from people. We make things. We look at things that other people have made, at spaces that other people have stewarded and landscaped and made habitable, or who are threatening to make space uninhabitable. And we respond and we interpret and we try to survive, and experience many of us are fortunate enough to have the experience of moving with a purpose. Like, I just know that this is my purpose. I don't know that much, but I know that this is my purpose. So that makes some things easier. But yeah, so this like being influenced by like a California upbringing, this race to save a father, the threat and the excruciating experience of loss, and the remaking of worlds is what I'm hearing in everyone that's spoken so far. And I feel akin to that experience of feeling compelled to mold and make new worlds through new work. I love hearing about, I love remembering Alteronce's studio during those days, because we were together for those 2 years that he was making those discoveries. I was just thinking about that first conversation about why Gumby. I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but you know how I feel about that. And so, like, I just love where the work has gone. Like, look at where it's landed. Look at where it's landed. What did I write down? Yeah, so clay paintings moving to glass paintings, from opacity to translucency, to light sensitivity, to absorb light and then to move light through, making photography complicated and difficult, such that one sees themselves and loses themselves in the surface of the painting as an object. That's where you've gotten. And that so beautifully articulates the initial question.
Right.
So beautifully articulates the question.
I was thinking about that because when you said that, when you were in San Francisco, and just to have, I think that just being able, or having the agency, having the agency to ask questions, I think is a superpower within itself, because a lot of people are afraid to ask questions because they're afraid of what they're going to hear. They're scared of the answers, or they're so comfortable and just not knowing that they don't want to alter their world in itself. So I think just to be having the agency to even like go around asking strangers questions about how you got here, to just in a way to reflect on yourself and how you yourself has gotten to a place, or to understand of maybe where you may want to go, I think is really great. I think every artist kind of has to be that curious observer to really grow as an individual. And I think that's something that you've kind of just have constantly done in your work, like to just go places and ask questions and to dig into those histories. I was telling a friend yesterday, I was like, I think Tomashi is probably one of the most scholarly people I've ever known, because while most of us were hanging out and in our studios or maybe having a drink at a bar, you were like hanging out in Yale School of the law library, researching cases from Brown versus Board, and just kind of digging up. I think it's just this inquiry to just ask questions and to see what happened, to realize what happened, and then kind of recontextualize that into your own understanding, and maybe help someone else understand what happened at the time and how that's affecting us today. Yeah.
I've watched some of your interviews online, and I've been, you've spoken so insightfully about community, education, schools, how communities are put together. And I was just wondering, given the piece that we have in the exhibition, have you been sort of following what's been happening with the schools because of COVID and how they're reacting to it? And obviously in New York City, we've been struggling mightily with that situation. Do you see it coming back into your work in any way?
Oh, absolutely, immediately, because as the pandemic thrust us all into a mode very foreign to most of us of lockdown, like domestic lockdown and shelter in place, which I just want to say that I've anticipated that there would be some cause to shelter in place since 2016. I did not anticipate that it was going to be an airborne viral pandemic. But I was afraid that there was going to be something. And there have been many somethings. I also want to acknowledge that there have been many disasters that have been rolling. One of our undergrad cousins, our Yale undergrad cousins, and I reconnected the other day. David Rico, you might remember Alteronce, a young indigenous brother from that time, one of the organizers of the Next Yale movement. He was really into photography at the time, and he took a drawing class with Will Vialongo. I was the TA. So we reconnected the other day, and he's been doing all this work on Afro-Indigenous foodways, seed saving and farming and stuff, learning and relearning and sharing. And he just spoke very perfectly and beautifully about the fact that there are so many people, so many cultures, so many storied experiences of apocalypse that have happened over and over again, depending on who you are and where you've been, and who your people are, and who you acknowledge to be human, and what narratives of suffering and survival you recognize as valid, that you've learned to recognize as valid. So yeah, the airborne pathogen, I just didn't anticipate that part. But yeah, so while in March, when we went into lockdown, I was in the middle of preparing for what was supposed to be my solo show at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Returning to my research about school desegregation, making use of the extraordinary archives at the Radcliffe Schlesinger Library, Northeastern, Harvard University at large. There are many libraries and many archives, as questionable as some of them may be. And yeah, I was gonna come here, have an apartment here. So I was gonna hang out with my cats and with my best friends, and not be running so hard, and just, you know, happily walk across the street to Radcliffe and meet with my RAs, and they were gonna find images for me, and then I was gonna happily walk to the only Le Corbusier building in North America where they've revived their lithographic presses, and I was gonna make prints. I was gonna make photolithos from their archives and then take them somewhere else and paint into them at the faculty studios where El Perez had already agreed to give me their studio for the semester. Everything was all worked out. And then the campus was evacuated for the first time since 1700 and something. Immediately, my team and I began to reimagine the notion of access, facilitating access to the work. What actually is the work? If I can't make the photolithos, like, it's like every day, every 4 days, the new plan changed. So at one point, the new plan was I was gonna have access to the Carpenter Center, and I would be the only one who would have access to the Carpenter Center. And then 4 days later, it was like, actually, no, nothing. So we started to work remotely, and I had a teach-in series planned, a public program of teach-in series, which Alteronce and Tunji both know that it's just something that happens when I'm in certain places. I'll have these compulsions to facilitate public programming. So the people that I wanted to be in conversation about school desegregation and its implementation, the implementation case that I never learned about. Again, this keeps going back to like how much I don't know. Living with the benefit of having a best friend who's a policy wonk, an education policy wonk, and now an economic policy wonk. So that's helpful. But there's so much that I don't know. So the goal was to dig into researching Brown 2, which is actually the implementation case that happened in 1955. So I was gonna have all these people come and talk about it. And I imagined us getting together and sitting in circles with them sitting in the middle, like in the middle while we all talked, the way that Jafari Sinclair Allen facilitated for us at the African American Cultural Center at Yale when he taught this extraordinary class the year before he left, Freedoms and Identities in Black Cultures. He would burn incense and sit in the middle of, pace in the middle of the room reading to us from Black womanist texts. And we would all sit in concentric circles based on our need. It was amazing. So that's what I wanted to do. And then of course, now we can't gather. So we started recording the conversations, much like we're doing now. And then we edited them and turned them into a publication, which is almost ready for print. And something that stood out to me while things were feeling especially, I mean, all of this continues to be uncertain, but when they were especially uncertain in the first months, I kept hearing people say, this has never happened before. There's no historical precedent for schools closing all of a sudden. All of a sudden, parents can't send their children to school. This has never happened in American history before. And we were in the middle of digging into archives and conversations and oral narratives with people who litigated some of this, who've gone on to litigate in spaces to try to stop the rollback of protective policies, that it's Black communities in this country experienced the sudden closure of schools when the schools that our late professor Robert Reed was a child in Virginia, shut down their entire school systems to avoid the Supreme Court mandate. And it wasn't just them. And there are all these ways that education has been made an exclusive endeavor, depending on the state's rights, you know? So I have found that really, that link really fascinating. And one of the people that we interviewed for the Brown 2 publication project is the Dean of Radcliffe, Tomiko Brown-Nagin. And she is an historian. She's just an incredible human being. And I was able to ask her to speak to that historic collapse. I always look for places where our contemporary history is mirrored somewhere else in the past that I don't know about and that somebody else knows about, so we can find out. And then imaging what they'll look like together, cross-hatched in the complicated image that is actually our present. Because we are never removed from the past, whether or not we recognize it. So yeah, so I asked her to talk about that, like the link between the contemporary school closures due to COVID and the school closures, the sudden school closures that were experienced by Black communities after Brown. And then better yet, like, what are the freedom schools? That's the next question. What does the Combahee River Collective tell us? What does Audre Lorde tell us? Like, what are the documents that have been truly suppressed that Jafari Allen would pull for us that showed that a lot of really complicated questions have been answered by Black feminist scholars for a long time. And a lot of us are just really, really late. So like some of the, I've become, you know, I can only like be so sad for so long, you know, so paralyzed by sadness and fear. And it comes in waves, you know, but something that I've thought about a lot over the last year is like, you know, rethinking how I'm interpreting excavating loss, and reimagining like reimagining the product, you know, like reimagining joy and discovery, like the opportunity of like rediscovery. So like, you know, we have an opportunity here to rediscover the strategic tactics of people who survived school closures by the inventions of freedom schools, community-based freedom schools. Like what are those ideologies? What are those pedagogies, and how can they be employed during this time? So when rethinking access, I've been thinking a lot about ice cream trucks. Like I've been thinking about sound, you know, growing up in Los Angeles and being a fat kid who loved ice cream, and then like being able to hear the ice cream truck many blocks away and getting ready for its arrival. So just thinking about like how sound travels, and thinking about the conversations that I wanted to happen in an intimate space, and all of the different ways that they can be turned into sound, such that they're a kindness that one could even not be staring at a screen for a moment and just listen. But also preparing for the fact that like I had to climb over this porch to get to a Wi-Fi connection that would tolerate how much we needed to do today, because we pay for it and it's that week, you know? So like also like recognizing that it is wrong to assume that we all have the same sort of access to these alternative methods of communication. And so like reinvesting, figuring out ways to reinvest in the value of the tangible object, what it means to be mailed something. Someone, my friend Ian Hawk, mailed me his new record, his new album, all the way from Oregon, and just sitting on my doorstep when I left the house this morning, you know, and then promptly came back. So like, you know, what is it? What is the publication? Getting my copy of Young, Gifted, and Black. And when my hands were not stained with paint from making those Ohio paintings, finally giving myself the time to sit and open the box and open the book, and there's Tunji on the cover, and there are so many of my friends inside, and reading the essays, and you know, touching it and smelling it, realigning with these bits of intimacy that we can't have right now.
The idea that creativity, if it's blocked in one way, it will sort of surge out, and it doesn't stop you. Your determination, it just sort of reroutes in sort of like a river, channeling you in different directions you may not have expected to go.
Right. And some really beautiful things can happen. Like this publication is gorgeous that we've made. I know, and we're talking about all this stuff that it actually, all this stuff is tied to what I've learned from the magnet school painting and to still remains that are in the collection. But yeah, I mean, they like all of this is for me, it comes back to this like center of like things that were produced when I didn't know that they needed to be produced. All of these things, this publication, Still Remains, was really difficult to make, because I didn't always know what it was supposed to happen. Like that was like pure feeling. Like nights alone, made here in my Cambridge apartment. Nights alone, just like wondering if I was doing the right thing. You know, a trip to Georgia to meet John Teal Robinson, who's the director of the Tuskegee Legacy Museum, the art museum at Tuskegee University. Meeting her on an Alabama dusty road, where she hands off to me her handful, or a bag full of Democratic electoral materials from what was the most expensive congressional race in American history at the time, between John Ossoff and Karen Handel. in 2016, John Ossoff having been the young protege of John Lewis, of the late Representative John Lewis. In Cobb County, the county that gave us Newt Gingrich, the county that is described so well in historian Kevin M. Cruz's book, White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism. That's a plug for reading that book. It's a really amazing book, but he describes how this seemingly innocuous town was a nerve center for what becomes, well, what we're experiencing now. Like the coordinated backlash to all of the policies, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, all the Great Society legislation that rolled out, the backlash to all of that, like the nerve center, unbeknownst to many of us, was happening in Cobb County, where it was this perfect storm that created this like downfall of paper materials that people were inundated with during that time. And John Teal had a whole bunch of it. Her first time ever, and she's never done it since, she collected these materials. And that's what ended up letting me know that that's what that piece needed to be. It started to figure itself out from there. So there are these things that like one doesn't know that needs to happen, that we figure out in the studio or moving through the world as if the world were the studio.
I think, I think just in sort of starting to look for a place to wrap up, just to sort of think about what I was going to ask you originally, which was to speak about the object, and then to hear you sort of speak about the world in this way that's like so passionate and so energetic and so beautiful, really, sort of answered my question. I was going to ask you, like, why is it important for you to bring mud into the painting, to bring a stick into Still Remains that's hanging in a pouch, to bring the election materials, things from the world into the work. And I think you've answered that question. I mean, just your passion and energy, sort of speaking about your experience in the world and the way that you move through the world sort of is perfectly illustrative of like why that stuff is important in the work. So,
well, I would like to answer that bit about the soil and the earthen materials. It's something that I picked up in 2015 when I was visiting Project Row Houses. That's the year that Sandra Bland was snatched from her car and found dead in a cell. That's the year that Nigeria Becton and Tatiana Rhodes and their group of friends were attacked by police officers in McKinney, Texas. And that's the year that Alteronce and I were transitioning from being first years in grad school into second years. So while some people went to exciting places all over the world, we had classmates who were going to France with their summer study grant money. I went to Texas. Because that's the place where Thurgood Marshall argued and won the first successful case of school desegregation that became the famous among litigators, this famous like foothold from which all of the Brown cases became accessible. And that was called Sweat versus Painter. You can't make this stuff up. So I, as a painter, went to the place where I was conceived and born, where I hadn't been since I was taken from there as a baby, found refuge at Project Row Houses because I realized that it wasn't safe for me to do the public experiments that I intended to do because all these crazy things were happening to Black women and girls. And so it was there in that hot little shack, in the what are they called? Yeah, in the shotgun shack. So I was in one that wasn't air conditioned. So I practiced things. I started like soaking gauze. I was trying to figure out if a material could absorb a space. Mm-hmm. Like if site specificity could be something that was like, absorbed into a surface. A question that I've had since I got to, when I finished undergrad at Cooper Union, I was studying with Dory Ashton, who was friends with Ad Reinhardt and Barnett Newman and, that set, the Betty Parsons Gallery set. And she would write about them and she would smoke her cigarettes, her capris in class, and she would talk about this world of meaning, that was not the way that we learned page by page in the art history book that kind of like dehumanized modernism. She would speak about the humanism of modernism because they were her friends. And I started to learn about Ad Reinhardt in a way that really intrigued me. And I began thinking about, from Diego Rivera, from John Biggers, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros Orozco, to Barnett Newman, Ad Reinhardt, Jack Whitten. Like, how does one embed issues of public concern, embed issues of the artist's concern into a material by method, not by didactic figuration, I'm sorry. By method, not by didactic figuration. How are they related? Like, how is the artist handling of the surface? Like what's happening with Alteronce now? Like, how does one get there? And I was hot and angsty, so I was like, I want to be there now. But I had to ask all these questions. I had to do all this figuring out the material to get there. And Texas was a key pivotal place for that. And that's where I started collecting soil from the front of the row house, where Rick Lowe and Ryan Dennis let me hang out. That's when I started mixing it into a formula and embedding it into the surface of the gauze in geometrical shapes, just really squares, rectangles. And then that ended up coming back to Yale with me, coming back to the studio and taking on a greater meaning. So at the time I was like really, really thinking about location and how to articulate location, not in a way that was necessarily meant to be immediately decodable, but something that could be felt more than told. So when I was in when I was in Georgia, before Still Remains, while the materials for Still Remains were starting to congeal around me, I came upon a hole in the ground that had been a community center in a swiftly gentrifying neighborhood where the Curator lived, and where I was like staying as a guest. The first time I went there was a house, and I heard the story about the things that happened in that house and how the condos moved in across the street and that the property was being sold and the community was sad. The second site visit, it was gone. And all that was there was a hole, and the hole was red. So before I left, I made it my business to crawl into the hole in the ground and collect the reddest, deepest soil that I could find. It was like the soil that was closer to the surface was less so, like mixed with gravel and stuff. But when I went deeper and started digging, it was more like clay, and it was very, very red. So she sent that back to Cambridge to me, and that became a part of the logic of Still Remains. And so it stays with me now. So the new work in Ohio, the team at the Wexner Center went to a sacred site, an underground railroad site called Lucy D.A.P. Park. And they dug up 7.5 pounds of soil and sent it to me in bags. And so that in these new paintings, that is like interplays with a mixture that I've made from Pentelic marble dust that I collected with my hands in a quarry in Athens, Greece. The same quarries that supplied the marble for the restoration of the Acropolis and all the other holy rocks. The same sites, the same friezes, specifically the Parthenon, the way that we picture justice, all roads for us lead back to the Supreme Court, all roads toward a more complete experience of humanity in public space, all roads here for us and our story lead back to the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court is modeled after the Parthenon. So that earthen material interacts with material from the Underground Railroad in Ohio. And all of this, I trace all of this back to Still Remains.
Wow. That's a great story, Tomashi.
I mean, I think not only does it answer the question, but it sort of ties up sort of all the themes and all the things that I think we've heard people speak to throughout the discussion. So I think it's a wonderful place to sort of land on and to sort of hear your passion and energy about it, and to sort of let that kind of sum up the discussion. I think is a wonderful place to sort of end. And I guess just as on a personal level, just to say thank you to all of you, Tomashi, Tunji, Alteronce, and then as co-curator of the exhibition and my official capacity to also thank you. Just to say it was a pleasure sort of working with your work and getting to know your work through working with Bernard over the years. So just to say thank you on my part to you, and then also to Bart and to Bernard again. And then if anybody has any sort of concluding thoughts, feel free. But what a wonderful discussion, and so much passion and energy shared, and so great to hear people talk about their stories and their sort of personal journeys in this intimate way. I'm excited to share it with broader section of people. So thank you.